Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time to attend our summit. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nick Meach, and I'm one of the co-founders of Matic. Just at a high level, what we do is we help automate the personalization of content, including data-driven elements like tables, charts, text, and even AI-powered insights. We can even help do this at scale by distributing this content via email. So we work with a lot of customer success teams to help them automate things like renewal decks, business reviews, one-pagers, anything that you're including data that you want to be able to share with your prospects and customers, we can help scale. So without further ado, really want to thank everybody for taking the time to attend our Scale and CS Summit. Why are we doing this? Last year, we did a summit around AI, which was really well received around how AI fits into the customer success landscape. And one of the big topics that we keep hearing when we engage with our customers, as well as prospects within the market, is this notion around scale, right? Especially with today's macroeconomic environment. How do you do more with the resources that you have at your disposal? And how do you manage the growing number of accounts that you have? And so today's summit is really going to be centered around scale and how scale fits within the customer success landscape. So I do want to thank all of our speakers who've taken the time out of their busy schedules to attend our summit and participate and share their knowledge with all of us. Without you, this would not be possible. So really thank you for the time. If you are not able to attend all of the sessions, don't worry. If you registered for the summit, we will be sending out a link with all the recordings to every single session. So without further ado, I am joined by John Herstein, who is the Chief Customer Officer at Box. He's been there now for, John, I believe 13 years total. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You are correct. 13 years this week.
This week, that is like what? That's probably what, 20, 30 years in the tech world. So I really appreciate you being here with us today to kick off our summit. And I think before we jump in and get into the questioning here, I would love to do an icebreaker. We're asking this of all of our speakers today, which is, with the topic being scale, what is something, maybe not in the business sense, what's something in your personal life that you wish you would want to scale?
Time for hobbies. I would love to scale the amount of time that's available to do things that are fun, not things that you have to do because of being a responsible adult.
What's a hobby that is top of mind for you?
I am trying to learn how to work with wood. So just building things out of wood is sort of an aspiration of mine. But it's a fairly time-intensive thing. There's a lot of process involved and a lot of learning involved. And it's not the kind of thing you can kind of dip into and out of for 20 minutes at a time, because you have to set things up and so forth. So you kind of need big blocks of time or reasonably sized blocks of time. And that's just hard to do between work and family and just general responsibility. So love to scale that.
That is awesome. I too have actually been getting into, I made a table during
Okay.
the pandemic. And my next project is I'm actually making a fireplace mantle out of walnut. So
Oh, nice.
we'll have to
Nice.
sync up after the summit to kind of share DIY projects that both of us are doing. So
we should totally do that. I'm sitting at the walnut desk that I made a few months ago. So I'm, yeah, I'll show you pictures later.
All right, that is awesome. Well, to kick things off, you've obviously been in customer success and tech for a really long time. What gets you really excited about where customer success is right now?
Well, I think that the shift to the SaaS business model, years and years ago now, and we've been doing SaaS for, I guess it's close to 20 years now, really changed the dynamic between vendors and customers in a good way for customers. And it's sort of what led to customer success being such an important concept. And that continues through to this day. And like you could narrow it down to a few key things, but clearly the technology model changed, right? SaaS products are delivered differently than on-premise, enterprise software was delivered historically. The commercial model changed, and specifically the subscription versus, buying a forever sort of a license. And the result of that was that the responsibility or the onus, if you will, for success of that product at the customer really shifted from the customer to the vendor. And what I mean by that is if you think about buying perpetual licenses, you made a decision up front to buy a piece of software, and then you were stuck with it no matter what happened, right? Because you paid up front, the vendor took the revenue up front, and it was your problem, whether it worked or didn't work. And a lot of that stuff, frankly, didn't work. The number of failed IT projects was massive. Today, in a SaaS model, you sign a contract for, maybe you don't sign a contract at all. Maybe you're on a monthly plan. Maybe you sign a 1 year or 2 year or 3 year. Anything beyond 3 years is very unusual still in SaaS. And what that means is the vendor has a lot more responsibility to make sure things are working well, and the customer is getting value from it. And hence the advent of customer success, 15, 20 years ago. And what's exciting about that now is that dynamic continues. And it's probably even stronger than it was then, because there's, early on, SaaS was still new. People weren't totally convinced. And now it's like, it's just the way things are. The subscription model is the way things are. And there's a lot of competition. And the importance of customer success in any SaaS vendor's sort of arsenal of tools, I don't think has ever been greater. And so it's pretty exciting. It's a pretty important place to be.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I feel like the more and more conversations that I have, right, with CS leaders, I think customer success is now definitely having a bigger seat at the table, especially with all the stuff that is going on in the macroeconomic environment. So you've been at Box now, again, like you mentioned, 13 years now, and you've been at the company from, close to its infancy, before they even had a customer success team, and you started out the CS function there, right? Pre-IPO all the way to post-IPO, right? When do you really, what are some of the big shifts, I guess, that you've seen at each stage of the company growth cycle, right? Specifically at Box.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the history of Box. And you're right, I was not there for the first probably 4 or 5 years of the company. So a lot of that early stage stuff I missed, frankly. And when I joined the company was when we were beginning to pivot truly into the enterprise. So Box started as a freemium product, very much targeted at personal users. It evolved from there into an SMB type product where it had capabilities that were useful to businesses, but you wouldn't really probably call them enterprise class, in those early days. And that's around the time that I joined. And we were probably generating $20 to $25 million in revenue. That was in 2011. And what we were starting to see was behavior where enterprise users were purchasing Box licenses literally on credit cards. This is kind of the classic SaaS story. Salesforce had the same kind of a dynamic, and they were using it to solve typically departmental business problems, right? Like there's a group of people working on something that need to share. They need to share files, content, et cetera. Looked out on the internet and found things like Dropbox, like Box, et cetera, right? And that triggered some thinking in the company about the opportunity, the business opportunity, and the capabilities that we would need to create both from a product perspective and from a services perspective. Before that, our services basically was, support team and this little team we called client services, which kind of helped customers on board, but without a lot of structure to it. And, so the first big shift, I think, was moving from a freemium model to, a paid business model. And we still have freemium users, so it wasn't completely a pivot, but the core of the business is not really about personal users today. We still very much liked having personal users as part of our base because a lot of those users also have jobs, right? And can also bring Box and its capabilities to work. And a lot of times our paying business customers are engaging in work with freemium customers, right? So let's say you're a contractor and you're doing some design work for me. You might have a personal Box account and we're collaborating together, right? So it's still a very important part of our base. But one big pivot was really shifting the mindset from this is a freemium product to this is a paid business product. The second probably would be the shift from SMB to enterprise, because what you see is a very, very different set of expectations from enterprise customers than from SMB customers, including things like the willingness to pay for consulting services. Typically, you'll find small businesses are not very comfortable with that. They want a piece of software that works on day one and it's good to go. And when you get into enterprise, you have to start thinking about things like, how do we integrate this with our single sign-on solution? How do we integrate it with the other line of business applications that we use? How do we think about things like folder structure and security and all the other things that go along with it? So there's a much bigger services component to it, and that's a pretty big shift, frankly. It probably took a year or two to get the company even comfortable with the idea of like, we have a consulting team and we charge for services and we have packages and et cetera, et cetera. That was a very foreign concept in 2011, 2012. And then kind of going from there, I think that, just again, I don't know if it's so much a pivot, but like, how do you do all these things at the same time? So how do you support a freemium personal base, an SMB base, and an enterprise base? And at our scale, I know we're going to talk a lot about scale here today. We have roughly 120,000 customers, and the smallest paying business customer spends about $500 a year with us, or they're on a monthly contract and maybe spending, $100 a month or $50 a month, all the way up to customers that are spending 7 figures with us, 8 figures with us. So the range is huge. And I know one of the things we're going to talk about is how do you simultaneously support customers across that entire range?
Definitely. Well, appreciate the context there. It's great to kind of see again all the different journeys that you've been on, specifically at Box. So I guess a follow-up question to that is, when do you prioritize scale? I think this is something that a lot of us have questions with is, as we're growing your business, as you're getting more and more accounts, more customers are being onboarded, when do you prioritize scale?
Well, there's something sort of ironic about this in that if you are like Box was in those days, growing very, very rapidly, you don't really have a lot of time to think about future scale. And so you wind up doing things that are probably not inherently scalable. And then at some point, stuff starts to break, right? And that could be tech debt on the hardware, the hardware and software side of like literally running the data center and so forth. It could be tech debt in terms of the internal systems that you use for things like case management for your support team, or even your financials. I mean, when I joined Box, we were literally running the business on QuickBooks. Well, at some point, like that doesn't scale, right? So what do you do? And you never solve these problems in advance, because this is where the ironic part comes in. You don't know how big you're going to be, right, when you're in it. So, and you can't really afford to go build for being $1 billion company when you're a $20 million company like that. No one would make that decision. But there's a point where things start to get pretty creaky and you've got to kind of make that shift. And sometimes that means almost like pausing and taking a step back and doing some things and getting back into it. So kind of a long answer, but I don't know if there's an exact time. In a perfect world, you would find that sweet spot of things aren't broken yet, but we can see the need for scale. And you've got the ability from a funding perspective to actually sort of pre-invest a little bit. But candidly, I think that doesn't happen that often if you're growing very, very fast. Now, if you're growing slow, if you're growing 2%, 3%, 5% a year, even up to maybe 10% a year, you can kind of do these things more gradually. But if you're growing 20, 30% a year, 40% a year, you just can't keep up. And at some point, things break.
Yeah, and I think, no matter what scenario you're in, right, the moderate growth, high growth, I think one thing that I've observed, even just in my experiences at LinkedIn or even working with our customers, is I think there's this like tendency for all the check boxes to be checked before you start prioritizing scale, right? Like everything needs in order. And I don't know if that's really, I think actually one of my managers said this really great. I posted about this on LinkedIn recently is, don't let perfection be the enemy of progress. And I think that's so true when it comes to scale, is that, again, people think that they have to have everything checked. Everything needs to align perfectly in order for you to prioritize it. And that's just never going to be the case. I think you need to kind of iterate over time. So I guess maybe double clicking on that a little bit more, what are some of the signals that you saw that made you think, okay, hey, we have to get ahead of this?
Yeah, well, there's, again, that sort of creakiness that you see in systems where if you find yourself doing things manually, that you realize are probably not things you should be doing manually. Like, and that those will be somewhat obvious. That's sort of one sign. Like, okay, well, like, why are we having people do this repetitive thing over and over and over again? Don't we have the data? Don't we have the systems? And it turns out, well, actually, maybe we don't have the data, or maybe we don't have the systems, or we have the data, but it's not very clean, and or it's in a bunch of different places, and you start thinking about aggregating it together into some kind of warehouse. Like there's things that will sort of poke up, and you'll go, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? That's not working the way it is. Things might just literally break, right? So that'll be a sign. I think the other thing is noticing, if you're managing a team, noticing what your people are doing. And this was a pretty big learning for me at Box that I don't think I'd ever had anywhere else, is noticing the repetitive work that your employees are doing and what is common about that work, right? And we'll talk about probably a couple examples as we go through, but you'll see these patterns and you go, huh, there might be a more efficient way of doing that thing. And what tends to happen, at least what happened for us, is that work winds up getting spread across a lot of people. So no one person is feeling a ton of pain as a result of that, but collectively you're feeling a lot of pain, right? And that's sort of a sign that there's some need to think about this more proactively from a scale perspective.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think I guess in that example in particular, are there certain things that you saw at Box where you saw maybe work be spread across a group of people, and you're like, okay, hey, in isolation, maybe somebody's spending a few hours a week, but across the team of 20, 30, 40, 100 people, like this is a pretty big problem. We got to get ahead of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I can give you two examples, and it was candidly before we were even at that sort of scale. We probably had, I don't know, 15 or so CSMs or so when you start to notice some of these things. And I'll give you kind of two examples. One was a very back-end set of processes that literally had to do with like customers canceling, and really have a team that handled cancellations. And we wound up basically just handling CSM. It was one of these things where if you were the new, it's kind of like, hey, you got that set. It's like, okay, you got to go process these cancellations, because there was no great process or system for it. And we basically had this work spread across a bunch of different people, and we said, let's put it with a single person who has a mindset, right? And what that resulted in is essentially you're concentrating. Remember, I talked about the pain being spread out across a bunch of people. If you concentrate that pain in one or two people and make it their job, if they're operationally minded, guess what? They'll figure out a way to make it less painful, right? They'll think about what are the system fixes we need to make. And I had an amazing person who was never a CSM, just was really an ops person. And when he took these tasks, he was able to say, if we did this in Salesforce, if we did this in this other system, if we tied these things together, we could actually make this a much more efficient process and reduce some of that human effort. So one lesson for me was look for those repetitive, not so fascinating tasks and give them to the type of person who's got the mindset to go automate and build processes and that sort of thing. So that's definitely something I would look for over and over again in any team, is those kinds of tasks that are being spread out and could be consolidated and then put the right person on it. The second one was more customer facing, which was in our world in the early days, our CSMs were doing a lot of the work of onboarding our admins, right? So if you imagine every time a new customer signed up, the CSM would get on the phone with them. They'd say, great, what are you trying to do with Box? What sort of folders do you need? What are your users? And they would literally take the admin through the admin console. Here's how you set it up. Here's what the configuration options are. Here's what the implications are, et cetera. And if you sit in a room with all the CSMs, you'd hear this same conversation happening over and over and over again, literally one customer at a time. And it becomes pretty blindingly obvious at some point, hopefully not hopefully it doesn't take you too long to figure this out, that like, maybe this isn't the most efficient thing in the world. And so what we did was we took one of our CSMs who sort of had a passion for education, and I think she put her hand up and said, hey, I'd love to kind of do some training. And we basically built our first education role. And we took that admin onboarding process and said, instead of every CSM doing it one at a time, let's go create a public class that we can admins come to. So you become a customer, you sign up. Great. We now point you to the schedule of classes, and you now have one person who's super, super excited about teaching people and have them come to her class. And she's amazing. And now that frees up that time for the CSMs to go focus on what happens after the admin gets trained. Now you can actually get into your configuration, your requirements, your folder structure. And it's just a much more efficient system. And so look for those opportunities at every stage.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, and I think one thing that you called out that I think stood out to me was, you're noticing it in your one-on-ones, you're noticing it in team settings. I think another easy way to just really identify when you should be where the team is spending a lot of time is, I think, just surveying the team, right? Like, what are the most common you are doing today that are tedious, monotonous, that you want to potentially automate, right? And one thing I really learned at LinkedIn was, when you do it in a team setting, I feel like you may get one answer, but when you do it anonymously, you do it in a one-on-one setting, you may get a totally different answer. And so I think having both, doing a dual-pronged approach where you bring it up in a team environment, but you also give people the ability to do it anonymously, to be like, hey, where are you spending a lot of time? I think goes a long way. And I think the other thing that I'd like to add to it is, a lot of times, just speaking with your customers too, right? Like, what do you want? What are we not doing today that you feel like would be really, really impactful? And a lot of the times, I think working backwards from there, you'll see potentially areas in which, okay, well, customers want XYZ. We're not able to do XYZ. Why are we not able to do XYZ? Well, because we're spending a lot of time on onboarding, or because we're spending a lot of time on putting together, so and so, right? So I think there's also that potential as well. So as a chief customer officer, how do you convince the people that you work with, right? Maybe cross-functionally, to get the resources that you need in order to scale? Because I think that's a big part of all of this is, in order to scale, you may identify what you need to scale, but it probably takes a lot of folks rowing in the same direction in order to go accomplish what you want to do. So how do you go and get those cross-functional stakeholders to see what you see?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's at least two components to it. One is just, does your team have the customer facing resources to scale as the business scales? So if you think about, do you have, in our case, I probably should have said this earlier, customer success includes our CSMs and consultants and support. So, and education as well. So in each of those functions, you have a different way of thinking about how do you resource. And if you think about the customer facing resources on those teams, in the support world, it might be, what's our ongoing case volume? What does it take to solve a case? And then kind of how do you kind of do the math there? For CSMs, it might be account ratios. For consulting, it might be, how much consulting we're selling, et cetera, right? So each one has a slightly different way of looking at it. But the first question is, does the company support the resourcing that you need to just literally do the customer facing activities that you do? And that's kind of the easier one, right? For most. But it's not always easy. And I know there's a lot of CS leaders who may be dealing with the challenge of, like, does the company truly understand the value of customer success? Do they understand the value of support? That's a battle that you may need to fight. I can tell you that I've been extremely fortunate at Box, that's never really been a battle I've had to fight, because there's a lot of strong belief in my leadership around the importance of customer success. But I recognize that a lot of CS leaders do have that challenge. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Actually, I feel like that is a very hot topic in today's world.
Yeah.
I feel like, from Box's perspective, right, from the leadership, from the C-suite, I guess, how'd you guys get to that conclusion, right, where CS is such a big part of the business, right? And what is the perspective? I'd love to maybe double click there a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, I think I got pretty lucky in that. We have a founder CEO, right? Know what it means to be a founder CEO. And I bet you spend a huge amount of your time thinking about two things: products and customers, would be my guess, right? And I have a founder CEO still, after being public for 9 years now, which is amazing, right? Because he thinks about products and customers, right? And so I have not had to convince him, or the various bosses I've had through the years, the importance of focusing on our customers, making sure our customers are driving value from our products, and so on and so forth. And it's kind of funny, but in almost every budget cycle, Aaron, our CEO, will say to me, like, why are you not asking for more CSMs? Right. And I'm like, well, because I'm trying to fit within the budget. You know, the finance team's laid it out for me, et cetera, et cetera. But he always wants to know, why aren't we doing more? Right. And again, I realize that I'm probably fairly unique and extremely lucky to have that sort of leadership. If you don't have that, you're going to have to make the case, right? You're going to have to make the business case. What is the value to the business of having CSMs? What can we say about things like retention, growth, customer satisfaction, et cetera, by having this team versus not, or by resourcing this team properly versus not? And you know, again, not to say I get everything I want from a budget perspective, but I feel, you know, extremely fortunate. And if you don't have that, you're going to have some work to do. And I think you're going to have to, you know, you're going to have to learn the language of financials and retention and value and ROI and all that sort of stuff. And for me, it's been much easier than that. So the other thing I wanted to say, though, in terms of resourcing, is it's not just the customer facing resources, but the harder one is actually the internal resources that, to your point about scale, enable scale to happen, right? Because there's only so much you can do. You can't just keep throwing CSMs at the problem, right? You can't just keep throwing support agents at the problem. At some point, like literally, it won't scale because you just can't afford that model. So you have to be thinking about what things can we do from an automation perspective, from self-service perspective, from a tooling perspective, all those things. And the resources who do that kind of work are obviously different resources. And it is sometimes harder to convince people of the value of people like program managers, you know, or systems people or operations people, than it is customer facing people. And so I think you've got to also find the balance as you're thinking about building out your customer success function of how much of your resourcing goes towards customer facing roles and how much of it goes towards operational roles, or whatever you want to call those. And the answer to that question will be different based on the makeup of your customers, right? If you have nothing but really large enterprise customers, you're gonna very much, right, over accentuate human resources. If you have a massive scale business, you've got to go in the opposite direction. And so, you know, for us, again, given our scale and the fact we've got everything in between, we have to think about it almost differently for each type of each segment of customers that we have, and do some very high touch things for one set of customers and do some very digital things for another set of customers.
Yeah, as someone who has more experience, I would say, on the ops side, always supporting customer success and sales, I do think that is one side of the business that people tend to under invest in, that I think has such a big impact. And to your point, I feel like those teams are usually really understaffed. They're supporting not just customer success, but they're supporting other business lines within the company, like sales, engineering, product. And I do think, you know, I think one thing that I feel like has worked really well in my personal experience and what we see with the people that we work with is, how do you bring those stakeholders onto the journey and really helping them understand the why, right? I think it, just like we like to story tell with our customers, I think there's an aspect of storytelling that you have to do internally, right? Which is, okay, hey, I understand that you have a lot on your plate, but here's why you need to help be a part of this journey or be a part of this project. And this is the impact that it's going to have. And I think the best way to do that, what I have found, is really tying whatever you're working on to those bigger company objective that the company is trying to solve for a particular time span, right? So it could be, hey, we've got a massive adoption problem, right? That's what we're trying to solve as a company, not just CS, but, you know, product has a role in that, analytics has a role in that. And so, you know, if we go and tackle XYZ, we think that we're going to move the needle there. So I do think that there's a huge opportunity to better illustrate the why on how you get these cross-functional stakeholders to partake in these projects. So I guess that the next question kind of brings me to is, like, how do you strike that right balance between those bigger accounts, like those whale accounts, right, where you have a lot of resources, you're spending a lot of human resources, and then these smaller accounts that, you know, don't have as high MRR or ARR, but in totality, they might make up a large sum of your revenue?
Yeah. I want to address that. But can I say one other thing on the last point that's just maybe just a practical tip that might be helpful for people? Is that all right if I just step back for 1 second? So on the operations side, what I found at Box worked very, very well, was not on day one to go to a centralized ops team or a sales ops team and say, hey, can you help us do X, Y, or Z? Because the reality, particularly when you talk about sales ops, is through no one's fault, right? Everyone doing their job, you will be a lower priority than whatever sales is asking for, right? So if you're living in Salesforce, right, as your CRM or HubSpot or whatever it is, the people who manage that system are first and foremost addressing the requirements of the sales organization from a how do we manage opportunities, how do we, drive our forecast, et cetera, right? And that's just the reality. So what I found actually worked better was to start your operations team from within CS because you can set your own priorities. Now, it may be hard to get funding for that. So the other trick is kind of going back to what I said earlier, which is look for opportunities to make things more efficient within the resources that you already have, right? So if you've got a CSM who's like really operationally focused, like just is really good at that, and again, you find that you're spreading this kind of work across a whole bunch of other people, just pull all that work out, take one of your CSMs, make them an operations person, right? Give that capacity back to everybody else by shifting the work. So essentially, you're working within the same resource envelope that you had before. You're not asking for more headcount, but you're sort of configuring things a little bit differently. And that's kind of roughly what we did. Now you have a dedicated ops person who really understands CS and is prioritizing CS. Great. Now you do that, you make that successful.
And to
Sorry.
your and to your point, they're raising their hand, like they want to go and do this, right? So
Yeah.
that's also part of the equation too, is like, hey, someone is raising their
Yes.
hand, right? They have an interest in it. They want this to succeed, right? I think that's also a really good takeaway as well.
Yeah. Yeah, like don't pick some random CSM and force them to do this. But what you find honestly is that, and I don't know what the magic number is, but at some point in a team large enough, you're going to find at least one CSM who's like kind of burned out on the customer stuff, right? Or realizes maybe this isn't their true passion. You know what I mean? Like they kind of want to do something else, and like great, maybe they put their hand up and say, hey, if there's something else, great. So go do that. Make that successful. And then what we did was we kind of started to build as the CS function grew, we built more and more of a CS ops team. And at some point, you may decide at a company level to then go centralize that. And so our CS ops team basically became part of a broader go-to-market ops team, but we had enough critical mass and enough momentum behind it that we didn't just send our people over there and then all of a sudden it was like, okay, we're just going to do sales ops stuff now, right? Like there was already enough kind of built in there. So it's like almost incubate the operations function if you can within your own team, self-fund it if you can, establish it, make it really clear what it is, what it does, how it's measured, that kind of thing. And then at some point, if the company decides that really should be centralized, great, go centralize it. So I just wanted to kind of make that small point because it worked really well for us and that happened multiple times.
I love that. I think that's fantastic. Great takeaway. So yeah, so going, I guess, back to
Yeah, now let me answer your question.
no worries. So going back to again, how do you support these big accounts? Again, you guys went from, freemium to SMB to enterprise. Like, how do you go and support these enterprise customers who
Yeah.
need a lot of attention, who need a lot of love, to also, supporting these smaller accounts who are not necessarily high ARR, high MRR accounts, but again, in aggregate, they make
Yes.
a portion of your revenue. What is that balancing act? What have you found works really well?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. And by the way, it's not just that it's a big portion of your revenue. It also is probably a disproportionate amount of your churn. So if
Yeah.
you're responsible for churn as a customer success leader, it's almost even more important to think about that long tail, if you have a long tail like we do, because those smaller customers tend to be a little more fickle in terms of their kind of product allegiance, right? They don't put as much time and effort into things like change management implementation, so they're not as sticky, right, as your larger enterprise customers who are used to like implementing and rolling out a big change. They go out of business more often, they get acquired more often. Like there's just more churn, right, in that population as a result of the dynamics of that population. So you really do have to find a way to pay attention to them. And I think, when you think about the relative resourcing, you just have to think about the needs of each of those groups of customers. You have to pick some sort of segmentation model. There is no one, right? There's no perfect one. Some of it winds up just being how do you align to sales? So if sales is looking at the world as an enterprise customer, as a company that has 5,000 employees or more, guess what? That's suddenly your definition of an enterprise customer. Like, you don't want to be misaligned with sales because you want to be able to line up your CSMs and your AEs and so forth. So, pick a segmentation model and then start looking at, for each of those segments, look at the data. What's the revenue in that segment? What is the churn in that segment? What's the retention rate in that segment? Where do you have a problem, right? What we found is enterprise customers retain at just a naturally a much higher rate. The numbers are bigger, so when a churn happens in that size account, it's much more meaningful, it's much more painful, and it will get a lot of attention, right? Versus a $300 customer or a $3,000 customer churning at our scale, like, it's just not going to get the attention. But to your point, in the aggregate, you've got to look at those trends and see, is it trending up? Is it trending down? Is it stable? What's happening? And once you've got that segmentation model, and there's a few different ways you can cut it, then you've got to start looking at, now, what's our go-to-market motion for that segment, and it's going to be different again for each one. And then what's the resourcing required to do that? So the way we do it is, for our higher touch customers, we have an account ratio model, and that ratio varies by segment. So the bigger the segment, the bigger the size of the customers in the segment, the richer the ratio, and so forth. So we've got a name segment, we've got a scaled segment, and then in the smaller side, you've got a more digital first with human interaction where necessary. And I think that's kind of the hardest to get right, honestly, from a resourcing perspective, because you might be able to predict very well what that group will do as a whole, but it's actually really hard to predict what any individual customer in that group will do, right? Does that make sense? So, like, we're pretty good at forecasting the retention rates and the churn in the long tail. And so you can say, well, here's what's likely to happen based on historical trends and how things are moving and that kind of thing. But it's actually really hard to say, this customer is the one you need to pay attention to right now, right? That's really hard. So bringing in, to your point earlier about cross-functional partners, bringing in your business analytics team, your data teams, right, and really getting into that data and getting help from them, and then designing the plays that you're going to run when you identify a customer who's got a health issue in that segment. So I guess no easy answer, but you've got to start by breaking down your customer population into manageable chunks, and then deciding what each chunk kind of needs, and then doing your best to resource, for those chunks, based on ratios and whatever else.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think it seems, given the dollar size, I think to your point, I think a lot of companies will prioritize the enterprise, the strategic accounts, and they'll focus their time and energy there. And I think I even saw this at LinkedIn. A lot of the times, like, what you do for these larger accounts, right, is probably going to be a little bit more bespoke. It is going to be very specific to them. But a lot of times, like, what you do for them, probably a watered down version of what you do for them in terms of the data that you share, the insights that you share, is probably going to be applicable to that long tail, right? And I think there's overlap. There's a Venn diagram of, like, what you do for enterprise, what you do for potentially mid-market and scale. And there is something in the middle that is applicable. And I think that's something for people to take into consideration. If you start with that bigger and the larger end of the spectrum, right? A lot of the times what you do there, not everything, but some of it can be replicable to the long tail. So I guess.
Yeah, I think one way I think about this is sort of like a pyramid, almost like a hierarchy of needs kind of a model where, at the base of the pyramid, you've got your long tail, and you have to think about, what are the resources and services I can provide to those customers in a primarily digital way, right? Yep. So things like your community site where customers are interacting with each other with very little moderation on your part, your support knowledge base, any automated campaigns that you send out to those customers via nurture through your marketing operations team or whoever owns that. Every one of your customers should get that base layer, right, of resources and services. And then as you work your way up the pyramid, what customers get is going to start to get a little more sort of rarefied, right? And when you get to the very, very pinnacle, your largest customers, it might be like they've got a dedicated name CSM who only works with that customer, or only works with that customer and 3 or 4 or 5 others, right? Maybe they get access to your customer advisory board. Like, there's just things you're going to do at that level. And so you have to think about, to your point, what can you do down here that scales upwards? And what can you do up here that you can say, oh, there's a version of that we can push downwards. So as one example, we have like historically, we've had a product advisory board that maybe our biggest customers were in, but then you can start thinking about like what would an SMB product advisory board look like? Because their requirements of the product may actually look different than very, very large enterprise customers. Or we have a pretty big business in higher ed. Well, it turns out higher ed customers have a different set of requirements sometimes than commercial customers. So maybe you have an advisory board for higher ed customers, right? So it's just those are the things you need to think about. And exactly what you said, you've got to be thinking about how can you do things up here that you can start to push down, and how can you do things down here that you can kind of push up. A great example of this, if people want like one video to go watch after this session, after your day's all over, watch the interviews of Brian Chesky. I think Reid Hoffman did one in Masters of Scale, where he kind of talks about this 10-star customer experience. I don't know if you've seen that or not, but he sort of did this piece early on with the team to say like, okay, everyone knows what 4-star service looks like, but what would 5-star service look like, or 6-star, 7-star? And you start coming up with these like absolutely insane ideas, right, for how you could treat a customer. Like, okay, the customer's going to get picked up in a hot air balloon and brought to their Airbnb, and like stuff you could never right replicate or scale in any meaningful way. But then you start thinking about, okay, well, if you dial back from that, what's the closest you could come to that, right, in a more scalable way, and kind of work your way backward. But start with the aspiration of like, what if every customer could have the most amazing experience ever? What would that look like? And then how can you build systems and processes to try and do that for a bigger set of your customers?
I think one of the things that you touched upon on the digital side, I know we're almost at time here. I know, you talked a lot about, hey, on the digital, it's a little bit hands off, right? You're trying to automate as much as possible. You're trying to scale, right? But how do you maintain that human touch, which I think in today's time where everybody's stuck behind a Zoom, right? How do you have that human touch when it comes to going more digital, right? And, you've got all
Yeah.
these different touch points in the customer journey, right? Onboarding, adoption, renewal, expansion. How do you maintain that human touch?
I mean, it's not an easy question to answer, honestly, because if you're literally talking about a set of customers where perhaps the only human interaction they're going to have is when they log a support case, like how do you do that, right? You literally can't have a human interaction. We have customers who sign up through an online sales channel, don't have a name CSM, don't buy consulting services, mostly interact with support through an email-based case and so forth. So there's not a lot of that. So it's pretty hard. I think one thing I would think about is, what is the voice of your company in terms of how you engage with customers, and think about it, how you engage with customers in a non-scaled way. So like literally, what's the voice? Like when you send out marketing emails, or you host an event or whatever it is, how do you talk to them, right? And then think about that language and that tone, and then anything you do in a purely digital way, make sure it carries that same tone and that same voice. If that makes sense. It sounds a little obscure maybe, but like they're interacting with your company, and your company should have that voice. And it's not going to replace an actual human talking to them, but it's almost like you should have a personality, and that personality should come through whatever channel you engage with your customers with, even if it's digital.
Well, I think a big component of that needs to be personalization, right? Like
Mhm.
reasons why, the enterprise side, you are personalizing as much as possible, or trying to be as bespoke as possible so the customer feels loved, right? And I think a
Mhm.
big part of that love is the personalization that we do apply to that segment. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to do something very similar to help hopefully replicate that personalization, which then hopefully goes back to the customer being loved and being like, okay, hey, it might not be a human delivering this, but this is obviously personalized to me at this particular time. So there's a lot of thought that goes into it. So I think last question, again, really do appreciate you spending time here with us, is, what are, maybe to kind of end the session, is like, what are the top 3 things that you feel like CS and ops leaders should keep in mind as they approach scale within their organizations?
Well, I think one of the things I pull from the conversation is, again, you can't get too far ahead of the scale question, because you just typically you don't have just loads of extra money and extra resources lying around to like go build something that might not be useful for 2 years, right? Because you won't reach that scale for 2 years. So you can't do that, right? Most of us can't do that. But what you can do is like every day in the business, look for opportunities to like make things more efficient, right? And do it some of the ways that I recommended or find other ways to do it or whatever, but like make incremental changes. There will probably still be moments where you have to take a big step back and go, okay, we need like a step change right now. And I think sort of be open to that too. So like look for the incremental opportunities, try and recognize when you need something more than sort of incrementalism, and be willing to kind of take that step back and do something bigger. Maybe it's a reorg, right? And I always look at when someone leaves the business and like in a leadership position, look at that as not just a crisis but an opportunity. And the opportunity is this the right way to organize things, right? For what's going to happen going forward? Maybe we got here just because of the circumstances and the people and all that. Well, now I get an opportunity to hire a different leader, maybe organize things a little bit differently, set the objectives differently, and think about that as what do I need to do to be successful with this role, this team for the next 2 to 3 years, let's say. And so those are opportunities to kind of to do some of what I'm talking about. I think engaging with your operations and really your business analytics teams, whatever you call that, data, data operations, data engineering, whatever it is, because some of the stuff you just talked about in terms of personalization, that only comes if you really understand what your customers are doing. And if you can share that with them in a way that, is insightful to them. Here's what you're doing with the product. Guess what? Some of our best customers are doing this with our product and you're not. Or here's how you can do that. So I think engaging, right, really make those business partners part of your leadership team. Like when I have a weekly staff meeting with my leaders, I have someone from the business analytics team there. I have someone from the operations team there. I have someone from the people team there. So don't think of them as like arm's length people that you kind of work with. They're part of your team that's going to make you successful. And I think that's really, really important. One other thought, we have historically been a big exporter of talent within the company. So anytime you have someone in CS who wants to take another role in the company, don't be upset about it. Like actually be happy about it, right? We have had people, we call it internal mobility, but we've had people in customer success go into operations role. The person who basically leads all of our go-to-market operations started her career at Box as a CSM. Amazing. Why? She really understands customer success, right? She really understands the pain of that job, the joy of that job, right? She understands customers. So when she's thinking about her role doing operational stuff, she's thinking about it from the perspective of someone who's actually been there in the trenches, right? So be supportive of people moving into whatever role, operations, marketing, sales, whatever it is, because it will benefit the customer success function and your customers in the long run when you have that.
Yeah, I think Reid Hoffman talks about this in his book about tours of duties, about, you're going to have multiple.
He got that idea from me, but he doesn't talk about it a lot. But yeah, mostly it came from me. I'm kidding.
Well, I think my takeaway, I think, is like, I think to your point, I think the iteration is a big point that I think a lot of people need to understand, that, hey, you're not going to solve all these challenges overnight, and starting with something and iterating on top of it is a great way. And the cross-functional alignment, bringing people along on the journey, I think is really, really key. So John, really, really thank you from the bottom of our heart for attending our summit and doing the keynote with me here. Hopefully you all have gotten some really great insights from John, and really excited for the rest of the sessions. And again, if you're not able to attend all the sessions, don't worry. As long as you register for the summit, we'll be sending out a link to all the recordings, all the sessions. So without further ado, thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the sessions.